wanted to hear from you all about what was one lecture or session that you went to that just really resonated with you and that you feel is going to be related to your programs in some way.
Is there an order you would like us to follow, or?
We can start with A of architecture.
Okay. Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to see all four of the lectures and enjoyed all of them. And they were amazing and incredibly different from one another, which was, I think, a testament to the work that you all did organizing it. So I think there's something in each one that probably could be taken and applied to the School of Architecture. But I'm going to go with Alana for mine. I was really taken by just the tone and the voice that she produced with her work and about her work. And I was drawn to the ideas that she had about using fiction and suspension of disbelief and the mythology of donuts. Thought that was a cool moment. But in general, just the notion that she gave of like starting with the spectacle and working backwards. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way of thinking about design. I think the word spectacle, if you really got hard-nosed about how that lecture would sort of correspond to architecture, I think the word spectacle is a little bit volatile, perhaps, but I like that aspect. So you might think about some replacements for the word spectacle, but I like the idea of thinking about the atmosphere, thinking about the saturated, vibrant, spatial, experiential condition, and then using design to kind of basically back out of that. I think that has a strong methodological potential. So I'm going to go with that one, even though, I know that there are other aspects from the other talks that are equally exciting to me. So.
Are we sticking with alphabetical here? Is that the plan?
Yeah, I'm doing math in my head.
So are you design or graphic design? Either way, I guess.
Don't know. Yeah. Am I next? Yeah. Okay. So I'll go next. So I really was impressed with all of them. As a designer, the form is less of an interest to me personally. It's more about the research and the problem being solved, and then how disparate things can come together in innovative ways. So I really, as a game designer, I really enjoyed Iona's presentation, and the way that she presented her work, I thought was really interesting. The way that you could navigate it. I saw a real connection with her work in theater as well. So it really made me want to think about how to create narratives moving through the space. I really liked the sort of, I know a lot of the students are very interested in environmental issues. And so that's where the idea of looking at something one way and then being able to reconfigure it or see other kinds of possibilities in it was really interesting about the shelter group. And then the PEG, the students are actually doing album design, music. So we're looking at music and how can you visualize music and what are different ways of visualizing music. And so the math and rhythm and geometry that they were bringing to the way that terrain works and water works and weather works were all really inspiring. So I have a really hard time picking. I took a lot of screenshots, I have to admit, that I'm going to share with the students. So.
Okay, do I go next with the I? To me, I didn't see Iona's presentation. I was with my mom's hat doing my first college virtual tour. I did watch the other three. it's hard to pick one, because to me, the three of them have something in common that is kind of, they are at the intersection of another discipline, right? So all the work that they were producing, you couldn't say, oh, it's just architecture, or it's just landscape, or it's just interiors, or it's just graphics, right? You could see very clearly how they were taking best practices, and they were pushing the boundaries of the silos of the disciplines as we know them, historically or traditionally, as I went to school. If I were to choose one, maybe I would choose isometric, from the point of view that I see a lot of things that it could be done within my school with the students in the fabrication of smaller installations, the integration and working collaboratively with architects and with graphic designers in kind of bigger issues. But I also, the reason that I selected them from the three, because the three that I saw were unbelievable good, was that they tackle a little bit of social issues, right? They tackle this notion of how do we can develop an awareness of someone else feeling when they are an immigrant, or when they are this, or when they are Muslims, and they, you know, the biases that we may have, how they wear their clothes and so forth. So I kind of saw firsthand with their examples, the power that design disciplines in general, they have to create change.
So I go with shelter because they said break for lunch. This is the big takeaway. No, I don't think choosing between any of the four was a kind of mode that I was in. I thought, you know, I really enjoy lectures like the one that we had from Ilona, who I think she said either had an affiliation with Dunn and Raby as a student or as a colleague, and they were here a few years back. And even though, you know, I can't always think about how I translate that work into the work of the school or the work of landscape architecture the next day, I think lectures like that do a great job of just putting things on the radar that, you know, that I hear them and I think, man, that's a fascinating way to look at the world, and how might a discipline like landscape architecture do something with it. I really appreciated the fact that she said critical theory as a framework of design is very difficult, if not impossible. That's a note that I made, you know, like I think it's problematic at times for our disciplines to operate more as critical theorists than we are as designers and builders. And I know that project has been experimented with in a lot of different places. And it's one that, you know, I come back to a lot and think, you know, it's not what we do the best, I think. So how do we engage those people and have them productively help us think about how landscape architecture and architecture and these other disciplines can be more critical, I guess, and operate in those kind of different environments. I really appreciated shelter from the sense of, you know, something that I think more about from the perspective of the school, and I think faculty are now, and I think it's a larger college conversation, but just, you know, the specificity of a place and building architecture, doing interiors. They didn't really talk explicitly about landscape, to like situate their architecture in landscape in a way that they didn't really have to operate on the landscape, which is kind of interesting. But I felt like their work was informed by place in a way that was not, you know, like too conservative or reactive, but you know, there was like a meaningful contemporary project engaging with place. Peg, you know, I know their work, have known their work for a while, and it's always it's work that always provokes me to think about the potential problems of the parametric, I guess. There's at times a kind of instrumentalization in that work that worries me. And that we, you know, like that the kind of overly digitally technological kind of driven work, like the remote sensing and some of the stuff that they're doing along those lines, I sometimes worry that becomes kind of solutionist, that there's not really ideas about what else they would do in those landscapes, but that it becomes kind of McCargian in that the answer is spit out by the mapping. I don't really think that's the way they operate, but I think it's a danger for practices that aren't thinking critically enough about those kinds of technologies. I kind of like the knot gardens because they use that technology, but they're so whimsical at the end of the day. There's really no reason that those patterns should be the ones that they realize in the landscape, and they acknowledge that and make something very different. And then the group last night, you know, I was just, again, kind of fascinated by the craft and the beauty of their work. Obviously, they did take on these really, you know, difficult issues. And so I was fascinated by the way they worked with the different groups. And, you know, I think as some of the questions pointed them towards last night, you know, talked about the context they were working in, and you know, as they said, like sometimes I think Jason's question was about institutionality, and they had to actually kind of tell the institution maybe that's not the way they should be working, or not the question they should be asking. So you know, that's another area of practice that I think you know, landscape architects, again, are not necessarily all that well educated in some of those areas. And so lectures like that really help you be mindful of some of your own blind spots and how you might deal with them better in the future.
Yeah, that is so great to hear. So just for clarity, moving on, I'll be calling on you guys for the next question, just so there's no issues there. So this next question is talking about the idea of craft and how we will use craft as we're designing. So on Tuesday of this week, we heard from Shelter Collective, and they shared how craft plays a large role in their enjoyment of design practice. In what ways has craft played a role in your respective school, and how can we as students engage in this more in our increasingly interdisciplinary studies? And let's start with Carrie on this one.
Hey, yeah, so I like to think of craft as thinking with your hands. In a lot of ways, I think it's the introduction that a lot of us had to the aha of being able to take a blank piece of paper and then have something appear as the result of work. And so from a typography standpoint, being able to develop an eye for being able to see the relationship between what's being said and how it's being said is, you know, again, a real delight. And I guess it's one of those things where the joy of the work starts to come in when you care about that level of finish. So I guess part of the interesting thing about working in design is that sometimes you have to work really fast and really broadly, but then there are also those moments where you want to give yourself the reward of just being able to spend some time really thinking deeply about how something is working. And so being able to move between those domains is part of why I think this is just the coolest job in the world. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. That's really great to hear. All right, Milagros.
So for me, it's a word that very often I try to avoid, because in interior, sometimes people tend to confuse craft with scrapbooking, or with, with kind of the fluffy makeup in the walls other than by the true meaning of craft. So I usually change it by makers, right? I am new to the school, so I cannot tell you how craft has impacted the school, but I can share about my plans of what I intend in the long term to try to develop. In the last 7 years, I have done 13 design build studios, right? And to me, it's something that I learned, you know, there is a lot of literature that talks about learning by making. Wilson was the first one in the 90s saying, oh, my students learn more when they are making it full scale. Yet in interior design and in interior architecture, there was a journal article 2 years ago that they used not to do design build studios because most, and I quote, this is not me, this is the peer review article, most of the students are women and women don't know how to use power tools. So you are talking to someone that my first Mother's Day, my husband asked me what I wanted for Mother's Day, and I asked for a circular saw. So you can imagine how upset I got when I read that that's even among my peers, that this notion that women cannot build. While I was at Arizona State University, my students were mostly females, and they build installations, they craft, they make. They were full-scale spaces that people could inhabit, that people can jump on top of them, that people could climb. And I think that there is a level of sophistication that they develop in joinery, in materiality, a level of responsibility, understanding the material as a life cycle of the material, and a level of responsibility from the point of view of social justice, and also from responsibility itself, right? Will it break? Will it hurt someone? And so forth. So to me, it should be part of any discipline in design education to at some point give the opportunity to make. When I was a student, we will be shipped in a bus to the farthest low-income place that exists in the country, and that's where we will learn how to dig foundations, work with rebar, do reinforced foundations, layer brick wall, and so forth. So it was a way to really understand the praxis of the theory of how the wall is put together and the practice, and putting both of them combined. And I hope that I can bring some of this passion that is very close to my heart, especially because I have seen firsthand how much it changed the students forever. That's where I am.
Yeah, I think that's great to hear. It is always so much more impactful learning by doing, I would say. So Gail, what are your thoughts on this?
Craft is a tricky one, because I think by necessity, in most of the places I've taught, there's really been no design build program, which is, I think maybe as Milagros was just saying, there's a lot of associations of craft with, actually building stuff. And so I've always thought about how we have to expand that notion of craft into a bunch of other things that we're producing, because otherwise we're just never really going to get a touch craft, honestly, right? And I know design build's done very well here, but I've been in a lot of places where things that, were done in the name of craft weren't all that well crafted. And so I think that's a potential pitfall too, of thinking about it too narrowly. So, like I'm interested in, and I think it's why you see people in the building harping on the crafting of drawings, right? And Andrew's probably helping our students craft beautiful or elegant scripts in Grasshopper. So I think craft is something that I think about it more as a kind of attention to detail, and a sort of sensibility that you hope when you do then encounter kind of any medium, you're able to think about how well crafted it is. There's a book that I like to think about from time to time. It's called How to Read Like a Writer. And she goes in and she dissects like sentence, paragraph, chapter, and uses literary examples to show how how this writing was kind of exquisitely crafted. And I thought that's kind of an interesting, like it helps us, I think about how landscapes are crafted and how you can, think about craft in many different ways.
Jason?
Yeah, a lot has been said, and that I agree with, and I'll try not to repeat that. I mean, just to pick up where Gail left off, that I was thinking about the lecture Jeffrey Day gave. When was that? I think it was mid-fall, and he posed I think the name of the lecture was Witchcraft, WHICH. craft, which craft, as if there's a multiplicity of crafts that you might choose from and that you might invoke at the appropriate time. And maybe knowing which one to invoke when is part of the craft of doing things. And so, I mean, craft is obviously huge in all of the design disciplines, you know, and maybe in slightly different ways, but I think there's a strong overlap, something sort of deeply shared around the notion of craft. And I tend to think of it as like the mechanics of engagement. So not so much as do you have good craft or bad craft, but how you do something is how you do everything. That how you engage, right? The mechanics of engagement are as important as what you're working on. So how you work on something matters greatly. And I think that I see a lot of pedagogy in the curriculum, particularly in first year, where students are figuring out how to work. I think a lot of our classes that are teaching representation and visualization strategies are trying to impart capacity to students in the college, students in the School of Architecture for sure, but I think in the college as well, with just a carrying capacity, the capacity to work in different ways and to really explore how to work on a project and not see that as homogenous or see that as affiliating your project with one way of making or thinking at the exclusion of the others, which is why I like the idea of which craft do we use, the multiplicity of the notion of craft. So I think mechanics of engagement is a pretty interesting way of thinking about craft. Like, how are you going to engage? What's the discipline of engagement? For how long? I think that engagement's temporal by nature. You know, how to be rigorous in terms of engagement. And so, in addition to the things that have been said already, I would add that to the conversation. You know, that craft in the sense of how you work and the discipline of doing work. And I think that's you know, that's as important at certain moments in one's design career as what you work on. And obviously they can inform one another, but I think it's interesting to think about on its own, you know, how to work and what kind of carrying capacity are you producing for yourselves as students that will load the toolkit for a long, productive career out in the professions.
Yeah, that's definitely great to hear. And I appreciate all of the thoughtful answers that you guys are giving. This is just great. So next, we're going to be asking about temporality. And I will be putting all of these questions in the chat because some of them are a little long. So this question is saying, in their description of their process, Isometric Studio shared details about the timelines of their projects from their initial meeting with the client to the final design being printed and displayed. Most importantly, they mentioned how the temporality of their projects impacts their design processes. With our multidisciplinary audience, should you share how your respective, or would you share how your respective discipline or yourself as a designer deals with temporality in your work? And we will start with Jason.
You know, I think a great example of this is, frankly, like this summer, the crushing task of figuring out how to do social distancing, distance studios, right? And that's one could think that's a spatial problem. And I think that largely, you know, across the university, it was engaged as a spatial problem, and it is a spatial problem. But the solution was actually a temporal solution. So a choreography in time of occupation. And I think that in a way, that's something our college, the people charged with you know, with working on that problem this summer. I mean, that's something that we should have imminently expected of ourselves, right? To invoke a strategy that is temporal, maybe more than spatial, certainly in terms of how it made possible what we've been experimenting with last semester and this semester in terms of, you know, the orange gray cadence of the studios. And so, you know, I think landscape architecture has always had the edge over architecture, just to talk about those two disciplines in sort of strict terms. And I think in doing so, I'm reminding myself of the power of the overlap of them, or what we share. But the idea in landscape architecture of thinking about a project really over a much longer time span unsettles the ways in which architects often think about their projects as completed, let's say on the day that they open or the day that they are occupied. And that's the moment you want to photograph and freeze in time and remember, versus a sense of temporality and a kind of time code of the life of that object. And so I think that's a productive crossover that we have here in the college, is, that the way in which a discipline that's much more equipped to deal with the temporal score of a project might influence the way that we think about architecture, which could be seen, as more fixed in time than not. And again, I'm trying to invoke more of a strict sense of that, because I think what we see all around us in studio, in fact, is the blurring of the temporal and the spatial and formal. And I think that that's to great advantage for the college and great advantage for the, how we're preparing students to go on, and to work in ways that are sophisticated. So, to me, I think the temporal dimension is, is open. It's open for the work of designers in ways that may radicalize how we think about the category of space and form. Certainly when we think about material logics, construction logics in architecture, well, in all the fields, I think that the temporal dimension of those can really be fertile ground for thinking about, the true wildlife of a piece of architecture in time. I like to think about that opening day, right? The ribbon cutting of a piece of architecture as a really loaded moment where two temporal vectors are implied on that opening day. One that's restorative, that goes back in time and tries to recover the intent of the architect and the process that the architects have used in order to produce that thing. And one that is wildly open to the interpretive life of that piece of architecture through time, the way in which that building or that project will get appropriated and renamed and recast and owned by varying publics, really, I think, is a kind of wilding of the idea that architecture is fixed in time. And so that moment is really powerful. And I think some of the best design processes that we see around us are ones that kind of bring those two vectors into strong dialogue, that the intent of the designer is also engaged in the life of the object through time. And so, so I feel like the temporal is, is a really key condition, and one that I feel like, we're preparing students through our teaching to really understand and to use to absolute advantage.
Yeah, that's great. And just to clarify, well, at least as I understand temporality and the temporal nature of things, to me, that is talking about the lifespan of an object, exhibit, building, installation, etc. And it's also talking about how it may or may not be receptive to change over the period of that lifespan. So Milagros, what are your thoughts on this?
You have my head spinning. I think that two things. One, I think that every single object and life that exists in the planet is part of an ecosystem, and we need to adapt. If we don't adapt and we change, we perish, right? Plenty of species have perished because they haven't been able to adapt. I don't know, plenty of toys that I used to have when I was a kid, they perish because newer generations don't use them. So I think that this notion of time needs to be associated with our ability to listen and adapt to an ever-evolving world. So that I think that also this notion of temporality is associated with ethics. And when I talk about ethics, I talk about many different aspects that our disciplines touch. probably I will start with environmental ethics from the point of view of the life cycle of the material. What happens if it is an installation that is going to be temporal? What happens with the materials once we dispose them? How long will it take to, can we recycle them? Are they biodegradable? And so forth. I would also talk in that line of sustainability with the buildings, right? One of the things that I am an architect, I taught in architecture the first 9 years. I practice architecture, but one of the beauties about interiors is that we have this ability to adapt much more faster than the building itself, right? It's the interiority experience can change every 5-10 years, but the building will stay maybe for 100 years. So trying to think about what is our role and responsibility with the building that is going to stay for 100 years. It's something that it needs to be also very well thought, so we can leave its span of time. And once it needs to leave this earth, does it in a way that is responsible. I think that it's also this notion of time is associated with social issues. There are things that maybe, and spaces and experiences that we are paying attention today as architects that maybe 100 years ago we were not paying attention, or even 20 years ago we were not paying attention. That I would say, oh, this lecture that I was taught at school is wrong, right? It's wrong today, was not wrong when I had it. And I think that again, it goes back to this notion of being ethically aware of how we need to adapt to today's change. And with that, I would also go to an economical ethics, right? If a project is going to be temporarily and it's going to be only up for 3 months, is it worth it to spend X amount of money or not, right? If a building is going to be for 100 years, what is the ethical and fiscal responsibility that we have as architects and interior architects to propose whatever the project that we are doing? So I think that this notion of time and knowing that everything at some point will be transformed into something else or will become part of the wasteland is associated 100% in the way that we need to think our spaces.
All right, Gail, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think I've always been somewhat critical of landscape architecture as a profession or discipline because I think we've gotten off easy in a lot of situations in relationship to time because people, you know, it's like leaves change color, they fall off, flowers bloom, and we don't really have to work very hard to get those things to happen. And so I think a lot of people have associated landscape architecture with time and change in a way that, like I said, just didn't really require that much of us. Even though, like as Jason said, I think there are profound implications for time in landscape architecture that we're starting to, I think, really engage. So certainly, you know, we've learned a lot from ecology about uncertainty and complexity theory, and the fact that, you know, like at one time in the 20th century, it was believed that ecosystems reached a climax state. And then if they were disturbed, they would continue back to that climax state and things would always become somewhat stable. And what we now know is that that never happens, that things are just continuously disturbed, continuously readapting. There may be tendencies that ecosystems head towards, forests in some places, grasslands in others, but that it's never something that's like a static kind of climax where you could say like history has kind of ended, state arrives. And so I think that has really propelled landscape architects to think about time as much more active as an agent, as opposed to a kind of backdrop that we operate against. So it's something that, you know, is much more integral to thought processes on all types of projects. And you know, so you started to see a lot of phasing diagrams. Some landscapes, you know, aren't even expected to become anywhere close to what, you know, the projected vision for them would be until 10 or 20 or 25 years out. So I think those are all really positive developments in the discipline that will just continue to make us more relevant because of the way cities and landscapes unfold. I'm also really fascinated personally, though, by I keep coming back to fast, cheap, and out of control. I'm really interested in landscapes that aren't expected to last that long, and that because of the medium of landscape in comparison to the medium of some other, let's say, disciplines that deal, like with heavy infrastructure, like civil engineering or something, we can potentially have a big impact without it costing a lot, and without also the burden of thinking about things lasting for too terrible long. So as in our studio, Carrie, we talked a little bit about a project by Michelle Devine, where they colonized the site, and they knew that eventually it was going to be developed, but they wanted to do something in the meantime. And the thinking there was that, maybe some of what was put in place would last or would actually either catalyze or inform future developments, but it was never thought of as precious and had to always stay the same way. And I think that, that way of thinking about landscape as something that maybe is, really fleeting or very temporary in the way we typically think about built environments, is something that operates at this other end of the spectrum that could be really liberating for us, especially, when you get into the amount of brownfield sites that we have across the country. That's a way to think about how we might productively engage those for habitat, or for some other even more kind of socially oriented use in the kind of short term, and then if they turn into something of greater value to the social ecological system that they're in later, that's perfectly fine as well.
Hey, so now that I'm caught up on temporality, I really like, I thank you, James. I really appreciate that perspective. And I guess I'd like to build on what Gail was just saying. Right now, the juniors are working with ecology and evolutionary biology, and one of the facets that they're trying to visualize is invasive species and the impact of invasive species in different contexts, and how to communicate that to a non-scientific community. And so what we're faced with is the ability to be able to show people time, because we can use kudzu as a really good example. If you look at kudzu, it looks really nice. It's very green, it looks very healthy, but what you're not seeing are the really the native plants that have been choked out or eaten down, or can't get their feet back under them as the result of everything else that's been going on. So from a design standpoint, the idea of being able to think of, I guess the thing I wrote down is sort of a circular way of thinking about projects. So not thinking about projects as a beginning and an end in a linear way, but being able to think about the sort of ways of being able to work on multiple projects at the same time and being able to make connections across those. So some of the research that we did about actually brownfields and bioremediation are influencing some of the work that we're doing with invasive species. And that's also helping us create a narrative about that might be going into different kinds of technology. So it even comes back to that idea of craft and making. So giving yourself the opportunity to be able to develop, to have different projects at different points in development at the same time, can help cross-reference that. I'm sorry, I'm figuring it out as I'm going along here, but is that enough?
Yeah, that's great. It's so nice to hear these perspectives. It's been really cool to see how, as each of you are answering, like you're touching on very similar things, but obviously not completely the same.
In different ways.
Can I ask Carrie a question?
Sure.
Is typography temporal?
Yes and no. Let's see. So I'm still working on understanding temporality. So typography is a sort of abused term in our discipline. On a very specific level, it refers to the actual form of specific letters within, within a grouping. And some people spend a lot of time doing very thoughtful work within that realm to create different tones of voice, if you will. As designers, we leverage the work that they've done to create communication, hopefully, or I'm going to say communication, depending on who the user is or who the audience is that we're trying to communicate to. So there are a lot of people who are designers who are not typographers, but then the term typography can also refer to the language of vision, or being able to design a book or design a form, a visual experience. And so, if we look at somebody like Massimo Vignelli, who I think y'all have some relationship with that studio, right, or that world. So his work, he didn't design the typefaces. He designed the use of them in order to communicate and to simplify complexity, I guess.
Yeah.
If that's a way to be able to present that. So he was very much involved with grid systems, and he very much influenced our field. So I guess that's where I'm trying to stitch together, the learning about him, learning about his work, how the things that he experimented with, and then how that's being studied and influences, the work that we do now,
Mhm.
and then moving forward. Is that
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
is that where you were going with that? Okay.
it was open-ended, but that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. I panicked for a second, Jason, because I thought you were going to ask me a question. And I was, oh, I'm not prepared for that. But yeah, absolutely. If there are any questions you would like to ask each other, or honestly, if the students want to add some questions into the chat, I am ready to field those. But we also have some more prepared questions just as people are getting their thoughts together. So this next one we've kind of been touching on this whole time. It's thinking about the idea of collaboration and communication in our different disciplines. And so many of the lecturers stress the importance of collaboration and forming relationships within their respective profession, as well as nurturing connections with clients, contractors, and the public. What do you see as some strengths within your programs for fostering this mentality and skill set? And what are some opportunities for improvement that you would like to implement in the next couple of years, whatever time frame you'd like to talk about? And we'll start with Carrie.
So just full disclosure, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. I love, part of the reason I love what I do is all of the people that I get to work with. So we've been working with primary content authors in physics, in biology. Now we're working with ecology and evolutionary biology. We've worked with civil rights. We've, I'm sorry, I've got them all on the bookshelf behind me here. But you hit the nail on the head at the very beginning. I personally learn the most when I'm trying to understand something well enough to communicate it to someone else. And so that thread or that pathway becomes sort of the nexus for why we're at the university and why we have access to all of these resources, and being able to there's a person over on the ag campus that is he figured out how to, Gail, you know, must know that certain moths will eat the thistle, so that the fields for the cows don't have to be sprayed with pesticides. Th- right? So, yeah, I'm sorry. So there are just these interesting things that are going on across campus, and then being able to figure out different ways to pull those together. Um, I'm sorry, is that too vague or too broad?
No, that's good. I mean, this can be as specific or as broad as what you're thinking right now.
It's hard to I guess it's where design is hard. You know, my mother still doesn't know what I do. You know, if I didn't teach, she wouldn't be able to tell people what I did for a job. So um, the because the form always changes, and it's always about honoring the content and honoring the what it is that you're trying to present. So that means that we're always learning, and we're always uh, acquiring new skills, getting new perspectives. Y'all are developing new technology, and you know, part of it is being a little geeky and enjoying the things that are available to us, the power tools, and yeah. So I'll stop there and let other people go.
All right, Jason?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, collaborate. I mean, all of these topics are just kind of like, you know, big ticket items. So collaboration is clearly important. I guess the way that I'll use my time here is that one of my favorite New York Times articles ever was an article that within which the author tried to reason out why the two-toed sloth climbs out of the tree in order to take a shit. Like why would that animal do that? Because its safety is in the tree, and it's such a slow moving animal. And in the article, they kind of work through this conundrum, I guess, this provocative question. And the only way to understand it is to understand the inner speciation that's going on with that particular animal. So it comes out of the tree in order to pick up a certain parasite. That parasite lives in its fur, and in doing so creates an algae that the sloth then eats. So to me, I think of collaboration that way, that we may be to the point where collaboration is so essential that to figure out a single thing about the way we work would force us into a similar kind of analytical frame mind as that author has in that New York Times article, that to understand the two-toed sloth in that particular practice requires understanding a series of interdependencies and mutualities that exist between species and kinds of behaviors that you actually may not connect on your own. And so that article, I think, is exciting for two reasons. One, it suggests a mindset that we might bring to the work that we do analytically, that we might look for those kinds of mutual transactions in a thing or a situation or an event. And then the second one, just because the second thing that I love about that article is that it plays with such a fundamental activity of that animal and shows the kind of innate intelligence that that's built into that behavior. So defecating, one could argue, is one of the most natural things that animals do. But yet it immediately becomes complex in a collaborative sense. And so there's a sensibility there that I think is really quite amazing and quite useful for how we think about collaboration. It's not simply borrowing a cup of sugar, if you will, from your neighbor, like borrowing something from a nearby discipline in order to work something out, but it's something much more complex and relational that happens in collaboration that I think opening ourselves up to that higher level sensibility about collaboration might unlock new understandings of things that we quit thinking about, like why an animal would take a shit. That seems very uninteresting for the New York Times, but in a way becomes completely fascinating.
Yeah, that's definitely, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that, but I think that's really interesting that you can view that situation and think of all of the complex interactions that are happening in that. Oh, and I see that we have this article shared in the chat for anyone.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Fascinating article. Anyway.
I really like the point that you're making, Jason, about that it's not one using some things from other places, but the idea that neither one could exist without the other, that symbiosis, that both are better, you know, or gestalt, you know, which comes into, you know, any kind of design thinking a lot. So
yeah, for sure. And
that,
I thank you. And I think the lecture last night, you know, in a certain sense, also modeled that kind of sophisticated collaboration where the kinds of roles and behaviors that practice took on in order to deliver the work, you know, that they delivered, and with the qualities that they delivered it with, was, in a sense, deeply collaborative. With again, without that collaboration sort of collapsing into some kind of simplistic notion of, you know, like a team working on, I mean, obviously it is a team and it could be described that way, but, you know, isometric studios seem to me to be in on the complex relationality of how to work on something collaboratively. Not to take anything away from the others, but they really highlighted that sensibility as well.
Right, Gail?
So kudos to Carrie for prompting for putting a question out there that gets Jason talking about sloths. I always liked, it's been a while since I've heard anything along those lines and I miss it. And I share, I think, a lot of the same sensibility towards collaboration. I think collaboration and interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity have, you know, as so many potentially useful terms, been badly overused. And so in practice, I saw this where you'd have these large multidisciplinary teams, but there was no real, I would say there was no real collaboration. People, you know, they had their own budgets. They came in, they did their work according to the ways they almost always did that work, and then they were out. And I think the notion of transdisciplinarity is potentially more compelling, and I think that suggests that the two are pushing on each other and trying to transform. Like if it's just two, and many times I think we're talking about larger groups of people collaborating these days. And I think that's a much more compelling way to think about it, that you know, the two entities that are collaborating on a particular problem, neither, you know, they're not just, it's not just an additive thing. They're genuinely finding a new way to think about whatever it is that they're kind of working around. And I think this is an interesting one for the college, because we have what we have an interior architecture collaborative degree or multidisciplinary degree. We have dual degrees between architecture and landscape in a couple of different places. And I think in all cases, we're hopeful that those people are learning how to kind of think about the two disciplines in a radically different way. They're not just putting on the architecture hat one day and then shifting over and operating as a landscape architect the other. And so I think the hope is that through that, that process of understanding the different ways that the disciplines come at the work, that they're then better collaborators, right? That even then when they go out into other teams, they kind of understand how it is to work on a complex problem with the many other disciplines that they will encounter, once they get out there. So that's that's an exciting aspect of what I think we're doing in the college that hopefully people like you who are in one of those programs are thinking about explicitly as well, right? Like that's not just the tacking on of another degree, but it's how are you, learning to operate in a very different way that is hopefully, more effective at collaboration.
Yeah, that was a great answer. And I'm definitely trying to navigate that and how to learn from both and then create something that doesn't necessarily tie strictly to either. So Milagros, what are your thoughts on this?
I appreciate that Carrie started her answer with, I work with. That's exactly the etymology of the word collaboration, collaborare, in Latin, to work with. So to me, it's a matter of trying to look at the word, to look at every single person as a unique individual that can contribute something to the table. So very often the way that I refer to this to my students is, look at the keyboard in your computer. Each of us is a letter. We rely on the other letters to write words. We rely on words to write sentences. We rely on sentences to write paragraphs, and paragraphs to write books. So the idea that we exist and we are dependent on one another to make something that is compelling is the way that I look at collaboration. I think that I'm gonna sound very Brian right now, but maybe one of our strengths is, like, right now we are teaching a course in collaboration, empathy, and community participation. So we really cover with the students. Very often, when I was a student and my first 2 years of teaching, we would say, oh, work in teams and collaborate, right? Without telling the students how we are supposed to collaborate. What are all the stages, from the listening, the persuasion, the alignment conversation, the adjustment conversation. There is kind of not, we give them theory for everything else, but then we expect that collaboration is happening. And very often, the students hate to work in teams, but because no one have ever told them how to work in teams, and they haven't seen the beauty and the potential of working in teams. So I think that in order to collaborate, the first thing that we need to do is to figure out who we are and what we can contribute from our own perspective to the table. And when we rely from other people that have other strengths different from us, right, that will force us to look at things from multiple perspectives. And I see a lot of potential of where the college can go, kind of breaking the silos. I see a lot of potential with, I didn't know the work that Carrie is doing with other schools, and I just wish that my school can do a lot more of that, to kind of go into other disciplines and collaborate. I was fortunate enough that after my second year of becoming a professor, one of my colleagues, who happens to be a psychologist with an expertise in collaboration, told me, hey, you have crazy ideas. Why don't we do a crazy idea together? So for 15 years, we did this interdisciplinary competition that I call it the speed dating of collaboration. Everything that I know about collaboration, or the lectures that I give about collaboration, is just being next to him for 15 years, listening to his presentations. But in this project that we used to do, is 10 days where we really teach the students that they don't know each other. This is how you are supposed to collaborate. What does it mean? What are the different stages? What happens when something goes wrong? How do you adjust that behavior? And how do you align the common goal to go somewhere? And I think that to me is something that we should all learn. Sometimes I tell my husband, this is an adjustment conversation, right? That is like when I don't know, when he's being the good cop and the kids are like, yay, that we need to have this adjustment conversation so we can align the ultimate goal of what we want to achieve. So we are collaborating every single moment of our lives, we want it or not, with our partners, with our kids, with our friends, with our colleagues, with our students. We have many different communities in which we contribute something else, and the task is like, okay, am I aware that I can contribute something to a greater good? In Arizona, just before I came, I was for 6 years one of the advisors to the mayor, right? So I have that role. It was a pro bono role, but it was my way of speaking on behalf of the design community, or speaking on behalf of the immigrant community. So I recognize my unique role and what I can bring to the table to make someone else that maybe don't have that perspective to be aware that everything needs to be cross-pollinating.
Yeah, that's great. And I would definitely agree with your statement that sometimes students don't like working in groups because no one necessarily taught us how to work in groups. I think one of the first classes where it was explicitly like laid out how to partner with other people, especially people not in a design field, was when I took a design thinking class. And we were running through a lot of different scenarios about how to approach different projects and perspectives even. So that was great to hear. I do want to give the opportunity now if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. You are welcome to do that, and that can be students, faculty, staff, anyone who's on the call who just wants to ask something to our panelists.
I have a question. In what ways in the future would you all see mixing disciplinaries within our own college, or maybe doing things like cross-disciplinaries with the students?
If it were for me, it would have been last week. I think that we all have the desire to work cross-disciplinary somehow, either for a semester long or for a few weeks. I think that there is a lot of potential. It's a lot happening already with the freshman studio, and Jason and all of you went through the program, and you know that at some point the architectures and interiors are all together in studios and you learn from one another. But I think that it would be great to develop something later on when you understand enough about your discipline so you can know what you can contribute from your own education to a bigger question. Great question.
We've actually done a couple of collaborative projects once with Dave Matthews, I think in the seniors in interior architecture. And then my information design students, we worked on a project with the New Hope Center at Oak Ridge, out at Oak Ridge. And it was, the trick is scheduling. So we basically scheduled both classes at the same time in the same space. And you know, then figured it out from there. So finding those opportunities can be really, once you get the logistics worked out, they're really, really interesting and really innovative. James sponsored a student who worked from I guess a architecture or installation. So we were doing signage systems and when we were doing the bioremediation project. So wayfinding and sort of interactive experiences. So I think I think the way that we think about things is a really interesting opportunity to get new perspectives, and I'd love to do more of it. So.
From my perspective, it's an interesting problem because you know, we're a 3-year first professional degree for the most part. That's what many of our students are in, and then you know, like the 5-1 is even more expedited. And I've come to believe that I think there's no proof of this. This is my take, is that to probably be a really good collaborator of the sort that I think is necessary, you also need to really know your discipline well. And so I think at times there's a kind of rush to collaboration that potentially, you know, can water down, you know, the disciplinary knowledge that we're trying to build up here. I think it was a designer, I think his name was Hani Rashid, said something to the effect of know everything there is to know about your discipline and then be ready to basically throw it all away at the start of each project or something along those lines. And I think that's important to keep in mind, you know, that it's good to have a stable disciplinary platform to help you understand like what a meaningful collaboration even looks like. So that's not to say that I'm not open, and I think there are already meaningful collaborations going on inside the College of Architecture and Design and with other disciplines. But I guess it's just more that at one point in my career, I would have kind of thought about like, you know, yeah, let's collaborate with these people over here. Let's do this thing over here. And now I think about them more critically and try to figure out, you know, like what is really going to be gained, especially for our students in those environments. And I think it's also interesting, you know, like the way that designers think, we're educated to be much more synthetic, I think, than a lot of other disciplines. And so I think the people that we're engaging with, you know, that maybe are from the sciences or possibly from engineering, they go into it looking for something very different than us, which may also, you know, ultimately mean that we don't get as much out of it as they do, I think. So it's still a work in progress for me.
Yeah, I guess we've signed on to 4 answers to every question here as a format. But I would just reiterate that there are a number of standing collaborations, and some of them have been mentioned, and you know, it's maybe a matter of making more out of them, you know, making a bigger deal about them, and taking them to the next level, you know, whether that's a joint studio, or I think of the electives that are offered in the college as something that could tend towards a true mixing chamber of student experiences. And so they're not always put forward in that sense, but I think that would be part of pushing them to the next level, is that you could get a series of electives that, you know, that become increasingly more available in each cohort of students' time allocation, the later they get in their curriculum. And those could really be a place that we would all want to be keeping our eye on. You know, all of us in the college would want to be looking at those electives and hearing something about them. I mean, we hear so little about them. That would be also a way of getting more out of them, is just somehow bring them out of the classroom and into some kind of visibility beyond deeply impacting the lives of the students in those electives. And those would be ways of just, you know, kind of advocacy vis-a-vis the communication part of this, of like getting the word out more, that the electives are a place where there's a true mixing happening. So
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the perspective.
Yeah, thank you all for your time and answering these questions so thoughtfully. It's been really great to hear from all of your perspectives. I just want to give you one last opportunity if there's anything you want to address to the students or anyone else who's at the call that maybe you thought you would get to talk about but didn't come up in any of the questions. You have that opportunity now. But if not, I have some closing announcements about TAAST.
I would just say thank you, TAAST organizers, for doing what they said couldn't be done. Right. you know, in the pandemic time, the age of COVID-19, you know, that the TAAST was dangerously close to not happening, right? Because like, how would it work? Who could get it organized? Da, 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 da. So it was great from my point of view to see that when it was turned over to a group of students who truly cared about it, that it maintained a high level of impact. And I don't know how well the lectures were attended, because I mean, we were, you know, I was part of the group that just saw the clean interface, but I hope that people attended those and got a lot out of it, because as a set of 4 lectures, they really truly represented a kind of celebration of intellectual diversity and design diversity. And so yeah, I know from my point of view, I'm very appreciative of the effort, and I know it's hard to keep the momentum going when so many things point towards how easy it would be to not have one more thing in your life. So that, you know, that's just to say thank you, and you know, for the work. It's appreciated.
I echo Jason's comments. I praise and congratulated each of you before we work with the students, but I tend to praise twice when the students are present, just to encourage them to be part of this committee in the future. I want to really commend you for the amazing job that you have done. You already heard me, but once again, it was very well organized. The way that you presented each of the speakers, the way that today you moderated the conversation, Carrie, I think that it speaks highly of all the 4 members, but also of Julie. I know that at moments it may have felt like herding sheep, but it was done, and I think that it was pretty well done. And I also commend you for the type of speakers that you brought, because they were non-traditionals, right? And part of our task is to expand your horizons as you move forward post-graduation with your life and think, what else I can do? And you selected a wide variety of opportunities for you to expand your future. So thank you, and congratulations again.
Yeah, I'll just say ditto. It's so much fun to get your brain bent, and these presentations have really given new perspectives and new references and new things to look up and new things to read. So thank you.
Agreed.
Yeah, I know we all had such a fun time planning it, so it's just great to hear that it was well received. And again, these recordings will be available for anyone who either wasn't able to attend because of class or other commitments, or if you just want to catch a lecture again, just for some finer points of that talk, because there was so much that our lecturers covered in each of their talks. So for these closing announcements, we do have one final TAAST event that's happening tomorrow. It is Picnics and Paddles at Suttree Landing, partnering with the Tennessee River Line Partnership. There's going to be kayaking that you have to RSVP for, and that link has been distributed already, but if you don't have it, reach out to any of our TAAST directors and we will get that to, oh, actually, Sam just put it in the chat if you want to sign up for that. And we will be doing bring your own picnic, social distancing, and making sure everything is appropriately adhered to in terms of guidelines. And also we have our TAAST t-shirts in, as well as our TAAST swag bags that are full of some fun goodies for you guys. Those are free to students who, I believe there was already an RSVP form, but we do have a few extras if you miss that RSVP. So be on the lookout for some more announcements about that. So, yeah, thank you all. I do want to thank Julie for helping all of us figure out how to do TAAST. And then also the other co-directors, Aubrey Bader, Aubrey is here, Maggie Redding, Jua Eam, and Delaney O'Brien. It's been so great to work with you guys. Hope everyone has a good weekend.